Miss Marple and the First Love Mystery dear friends, welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, and it's such a pleasure to spend this time with you again tonight. I'd love to hear from you. What is the reason you enjoy listening to these cozy mysteries? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, shall we begin? Chapter 1, A Parcel from the Attic. The late April sun streamed through the tall windows of Gossington Hall, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny golden sprites. Lady Bantry, known to her intimates as Dolly, stood in the doorway of the long attic, surveying the accumulated treasures and detritus of several generations, with the expression of a general contemplating a particularly challenging battlefield. I really don't know why I agreed to this exhibition business, she said to Miss Beatrice Vale, the earnest young woman from the Village Museum Society, who had appeared at her doorstep 3 weeks earlier with the most persuasive arguments. The clutter is absolutely frightful. Miss Vale, a thin, eager creature with prominent teeth and an enthusiasm that bordered on the exhausting, pushed her spectacles up her nose and clasped her hands together. But Lady Bantry, think of the historical value. A glimpse into the social life of St. Mary Mead at the turn of the century. The dance cards alone are simply fascinating. Dolly Bantry sighed and picked her way between a dressmaker's dummy wearing what appeared to be a riding habit from 1880 and a stack of hat boxes that listed dangerously to one side. The attic smelled of old wood, lavender, and that peculiar mustiness that clings to things long forgotten. I suppose you're right, she conceded, though without much conviction. But I do think we might draw the line at displaying my mother-in-law's collection of commemorative teaspoons. There are limits to what constitutes history, after all. They had been working steadily for the better part of the morning when Miss Vale gave a small cry of discovery. She had opened an old leather trunk bound with brass corners and was lifting out a parcel wrapped in faded blue ribbon. "Oh, how charming," she breathed, untying the ribbon with careful fingers. "Look, Lady Bantry, dance cards and pressed flowers. How romantic." Dolly moved closer, her interest genuinely piqued now. The parcel contained 3 dance cards, their tiny pencils still attached by silk cords, several pressed flowers that had faded to the color of old tea, and at the bottom a sealed envelope of heavy cream paper. Well, said Dolly, picking up one of the dance cards. This must have been from the vicarage dance in '96. How extraordinary. I'd quite forgotten these were up here. The envelope bore an inscription in faded copperplate. To be opened in the event of inquiry regarding the estate of the late Mrs. Margaret Elcott. Witnessed this 14th day of June, 1896. The witness signature consisted simply of the initials E.A. Mrs. Elcott, mused Dolly. Now, who was she? The name is familiar, but I can't quite place it. Perhaps Miss Marple would remember, suggested Miss Vale. She's lived in the village forever, hasn't she? And she has such a remarkable memory for these old families. What an excellent idea, said Dolly, her eyes brightening with the prospect of involving her dear friend in a mystery, however small. I shall telephone her at once. In fact, why don't I ask her to come for tea this afternoon? You'll stay, won't you, Miss Vale? I'm sure Jane would be delighted to meet someone so interested in local history. And so it was arranged. At precisely 4 Miss Jane Marple arrived at Gossington Hall, looking exactly as she always did. A tall, thin, elderly lady with soft white hair and the most remarkably clear blue eyes that seemed to see everything and miss nothing. She carried her knitting bag as always and wore a flowered dress that had seen better days, but was scrupulously clean and pressed. "My dear Jane," said Dolly, kissing her friend's cheek. "How lovely to see you. Come into the drawing room. I have the most intriguing mystery for you." "A mystery, Dolly?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle and interested. "How very exciting, though I'm sure it's nothing really." They settled in the drawing room where tea had been laid out with Dolly's usual attention to comfort rather than formality. Miss Vale was introduced and immediately launched into an account of the exhibition plans, which Miss Marple listened to with every appearance of close attention, though Dolly noticed that her friend's eyes kept drifting to the envelope that lay on the table. "But the really interesting thing," said Dolly, unable to contain herself any longer, "is this envelope. It mentions Mrs. Margaret Elcott and is witnessed by someone with the initials E.A. Do you remember the family, Jane?" Miss Marple set down her teacup with great care. 2 spots of delicate color had appeared in her cheeks. "Mrs. Elcott," she said slowly. "Yes, I remember her. She was a widow who lived in the old dower house on the Gossington estate. She died in, let me see, it must have been 1920 or thereabouts. A very charitable woman, though rather reclusive in her later years." "And E.A.?" prompted Dolly, watching her friend with growing interest. "E.A.," repeated Miss Marple, and now the color in her cheeks had deepened quite noticeably. "That would be Edward Armitage. He was the nephew of Canon Prescott at the vicarage, a very pleasant young man. He stayed in the village for a summer helping his uncle with parish matters." There was a small silence. Miss Vale looked from one lady to the other with considerable interest. "Jane Marple," said Dolly, her voice warm with delighted suspicion. "You're blushing. Was there something between you and this Edward Armitage?" "Really, Dolly?" "What an idea," said Miss Marple, but she didn't quite meet her friend's eyes. "He was very kind, that's all, and he danced the lancers like a gentleman. One remembers these things." "There was something," declared Dolly triumphantly. "Your first love, Jane. How perfectly wonderful. And now his signature has turned up on a mysterious envelope. We must open it at once." "I really don't think," began Miss Marple, but Dolly was already reaching for the envelope. The seal broke with a soft crack. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in the same copperplate hand as the envelope's inscription. Dolly read aloud. "This codicil to my will directs that the sum of $500 shall be set aside to provide an annuity for the St. Mary Mead School Library. Said annuity to be payable only upon proper identification and testimony of the witness to this document, Mr. Edward Armitage or his lawful heir, confirming the circumstances of its execution." "500, breathed Miss Vale. "That's a considerable sum." "Indeed." "It is," said Dolly. She looked at Miss Marple with some concern. "Jane, dear, you've gone quite pale. Are you all right?" "Perfectly, thank you," said Miss Marple, though her fingers had tightened on her knitting. "It's only that, well, Edward emigrated many years ago to South Africa, I believe. We lost touch." Of course. It was at that moment that Collins, the butler, appeared in the doorway with the slightly apologetic expression he wore when forced to interrupt his mistress during tea. "I beg your pardon, my lady, but there is a gentleman at the door who insists on seeing you, a Mr. Neville Gray. He says it's a matter of some importance regarding an old family matter." "Gray?" Dolly frowned. "I don't know any Mr. Gray. Did he say what he wanted?" "No, my lady, but he's an elderly gentleman, very well spoken. He mentioned something about having just returned from Cape Town." Miss Marple's teacup rattled slightly in its saucer. "Cape Town?" she said quietly. "That's in South Africa." Dolly and Miss Marple exchanged a long look. "You'd better show him in." "Collins," said Dolly. The gentleman who entered the drawing room a few moments later was indeed elderly. Perhaps 70 or a bit more, with silver hair and a neat gray suit that spoke of modest prosperity. He had a pleasant, almost diffident manner, and when he saw the 3 ladies, he bowed slightly. "Lady Bantry, how very kind of you to receive me without notice. My name is Neville Gray, though I was christened Edward Armitage many years ago." Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The gentleman's eyes found her, and a smile of great sweetness crossed his face. "And you must be Miss Jane Marple," he said softly. "I would know you anywhere, even after all these years. You wore a blue shawl to the vicarage dance, and you gave me half of a lucky sixpence on the terrace steps. I've carried it ever since." He drew from his waistcoat pocket a thin chain, and dangling from it was indeed half of a sixpence. Dolly's eyes were shining with romantic delight. Miss Vale looked as though Christmas had come early, but Miss Marple, looking at the man who claimed to be her long-lost first love, said nothing at all. Her face was very still, and in her remarkable blue eyes was an expression that might have been recognition, or might equally well have been something rather different, something very much like doubt. Chapter 2. A Gentleman for Miss Marple. The silence that followed Mr. Neville Gray's introduction stretched for perhaps 3 seconds, though it seemed considerably longer. It was Dolly Bantry who broke it, rising with her customary warmth and extending both hands. "Mr. Gray, or should I say Mr. Armitage, how absolutely extraordinary. Do sit down. You must tell us everything. Collins, bring fresh tea, please. And some of those excellent seed cakes." The gentleman took the indicated chair with a slight stiffness that suggested either age or long travel. He settled himself carefully, placing a worn leather case on the floor beside him. "I hardly know where to begin," he said, his voice carrying a faint accent that might have been acquired during long years abroad. "When I saw the notice in the Times about the Gossington Hall exhibition, mentioning documents from the 1890s, something stirred in my memory. I wrote to Lady Bantry, but receiving no reply, I thought perhaps the letter had gone astray, so I took the liberty of calling in person." "I've received no letter," said Dolly, frowning slightly. "The post has been rather peculiar lately. But never mind that now. You say you're Edward Armitage?" "I was many years ago," he smiled, and it was indeed a pleasant smile, though Miss Marple noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I changed my name after certain, difficulties in South Africa. Nothing dishonorable, I assure you, but there were business complications, and it seemed simpler to make a fresh start. I've been Neville Gray for 30 years now." Miss Marple had still not spoken. Her hands lay quiet in her lap, and her face bore that expression of polite interest that those who knew her well understood meant she was thinking very hard indeed. "But you recognize Miss Marple?" prompted Dolly, who was thoroughly enjoying herself. "How could I forget?" Gray turned to Miss Marple with every appearance of sincere emotion. "That summer of 1896 was one of the happiest of my life. The vicarage dance, the walks by the stream, the afternoon we watched the cricket match, and you explained the rules with such patience. You wore a blue shawl that evening, Miss Marple, and you had threaded white roses in your hair." "The shawl was blue," agreed Miss Marple slowly. "That much is correct." "And the sixpence?" Gray drew out the chain again, letting the half-coin catch the light. "You said it would bring me luck if I carried it always. I was called away rather suddenly. You may remember, my uncle, Canon Prescott, received word that his sister, my mother, was gravely ill. There was no time for proper farewells." Miss Vale leaned forward, her romantic sensibilities thoroughly engaged. "How terribly sad. And you never returned?" "My mother recovered, thank the Lord, but my father's business required me to go out to Cape Town. I wrote, of course." Here he glanced at Miss Marple with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Several times, in fact, but I received no replies. I concluded that you had quite naturally moved on with your life. A young lady as charming as Miss Marple would hardly want for admirers." "The post was unreliable even then," murmured Dolly diplomatically, though Miss Marple continued her silence. Collins returned with fresh tea, and the conversation turned to practicalities. Gray explained that he had retired from business in Cape Town 2 years previous, and had returned to England with the thought of spending his remaining years in his native country. He had rooms in London, but had been touring the countryside, revisiting old haunts. "And you knew nothing of Mrs. Elcott's codicil?" asked Dolly. Mrs. Alcott? Gray's face showed concentration. Ah, yes, the lady at the Dower House. A very charitable woman, if I recall correctly. She asked me to witness some document or other. I believe it was the day after the vicarage dance. But a codicil, you say? How curious. I assumed it was merely a letter to her solicitor, the A. Document specifies that you must provide testimony before the annuity can be paid to the village school library, explained Dolly. $500 to be invested for that purpose. Generous sum, said Gray. I should be happy to provide whatever testimony is required, though I confess I remember very little of the actual document. Mrs. Alcott was insistent that I sign as witness, but the contents were sealed. She said only that it concerned a charitable disposition. Miss Marple spoke at last, her voice thoughtful. Do you remember Canon Prescott? Well, Mr. Gray, my uncle? Certainly a fine man, though rather absent-minded. He would forget his sermon notes and have to preach extempore, which actually made for much better sermons, in my opinion. And his particular habits? Pressed Miss Marple gently. Any small mannerisms that stayed in your memory? Gray considered this. He had a fondness for peppermints, always kept them in his pocket, and he would tap his fingers on the pulpit when making a particularly important point. Why do you ask? Miss Marple smiled, but it was a small, contained smile. No particular reason. One likes to remember the details of people one was fond of. Speaking of memories, said Dolly, rising and going to a small escritoire in the corner, I found this with the envelope and dance cards. Perhaps you recognize it. She brought over a small box covered in faded velvet. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was the other half of a sixpence. Gray reached out for it, then drew his hand back. May I? Of course. He lifted the half-coin carefully, held it next to his own. Remarkable. After all these years they do match, don't they? But Miss Marple, watching closely, saw something that others might have missed. The edges of the two pieces, though they corresponded in size, did not align quite perfectly. Gray's half showed a clean, straight cut, bright even after decades. The one from Dolly's box bore the irregular marks of hand tools, tiny burrs and imperfections. Quite remarkable, she murmured. The conversation continued. Gray proved himself a pleasant companion with stories of life in South Africa that were entertaining, if somewhat vague on specific details. He mentioned places and events with the confidence of one who had truly been there. Yet when Dolly, who had distant cousins in Durban, mentioned a particular street, Gray responded with only general acknowledgement. And Griselda Clement still presides over the vicarage. I understand, he said at one point. I remember her such a lively young woman. Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their quiet clicking, paused for the briefest moment. I think you may be confusing her with someone else, she said mildly. Mrs. Clement, our current vicar's wife, is named Griselda, but she would have been an infant in 1896. You're perhaps thinking of Clarissa Weatherby, who was the vicar's daughter at that time. Ah, yes, of course, said Gray smoothly. How foolish of me. The names blur together after so long. They discussed arrangements. Gray would stay at the Bull and Bear in the village, though Dolly, with her characteristic generosity, immediately suggested he might be more comfortable at Gossington Hall. We have plenty of room, and it would be so much more convenient for sorting out this business with the codicil. Miss Vale can confirm that we're knee-deep in all these documents anyway. One more guest will hardly be noticed, Gray protested, but not very strenuously. It was agreed he would collect his things from the inn and return for dinner. A solicitor would need to be consulted, naturally. Dolly knew just the man, a Mr. Somerton in Market Basing, very efficient with estate matters. When Gray had departed to fetch his luggage, Miss Vale excused herself to return to her cataloging work in the attic. Miss Marple and Dolly were left alone. "Well," said Dolly, pouring them both a sherry without asking, "what do you think? Is he your Edward Armitage?" Miss Marple accepted the glass and gazed into its amber depths. "He knows a great deal. The blue shawl, the dance, the sixpence, these things are all quite correct. But," prompted Dolly, who knew her friend too well to miss the reservation in her tone. "But Canon Prescott had a pronounced limp from a riding accident in his youth. He never stood at a pulpit. He gave his sermons seated in a special chair carved for the purpose. And no one, absolutely no one, could ever have called Griselda Clement Clarissa, even by accident. The names are nothing alike." Dolly set down her glass with a sharp click. "You think he's an imposter?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, setting down her knitting and folding her hands, "that someone has taken great pains to learn certain facts, but has overlooked certain other facts, which is often the way with these things. People remember the large details and forget that it's the small ones that matter. But the sixpence, Jane, he has the matching half." Miss Marple's eyes were very clear and very sad. "Yes," she said quietly, "he does indeed have half a sixpence. That is precisely what troubles me most of all." Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Bitter Almond. Mr. Neville Grey returned to Gossington Hall at 6:30, driven from the Bull and Bear by the proprietor's son in a somewhat battered Austin. He brought with him a modest valise and a walking stick of African blackwood, and was shown to the blue room on the first floor, which overlooked the rose garden. Dinner was a subdued affair. Grey proved himself pleasant company, though Miss Marple, seated opposite him, noted that his anecdotes about South Africa contained fewer specific details than one might expect from a man who had lived there for decades. He spoke of the heat and the distances, of the difficulties of trade and the challenges of colonial life. But when Dr. Haydock, who had been invited to join them and who had himself spent 2 years in Rhodesia during his youth, mentioned a particular landmark in Cape Town, Grey's response was oddly noncommittal. "Things change so rapidly out there," he said with an apologetic smile. "One can hardly keep track." The doctor, a bluff, shrewd man with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes, merely nodded, though Miss Marple saw him exchange a brief glance with her across the table. After dinner, they gathered in the drawing-room. Grey appeared increasingly nervous as the evening progressed. His hands, Miss Marple observed, showed a faint tremor when he accepted his coffee cup, and twice he pressed his fingers to his temple as though suffering from a headache. "I do apologize," he said at last, setting down his cup with a rattle. "I fear the journey and the excitement of the day have quite worn me out. Would you think me terribly rude if I retired early?" "Not at all," said Dolly warmly. "You must be exhausted. Collins will show you up. Is there anything you need? A book, perhaps, or a sleeping draught?" "Most kind, but I have my own remedies." Grey patted his jacket pocket. "I carry sal volatile for my nerves. A few breaths generally settle me quite adequately. My doctor in Cape Town recommended it years ago." He bid them good night and left the room, walking with that same slight stiffness Miss Marple had noticed earlier. They heard his tread on the stairs, then the sound of a door closing above. "Poor man," said Miss Vale, who had stayed for dinner at Dolly's insistence. "He seems rather frail." "Nerves," diagnosed Dr. Haydock briefly. He turned to Miss Marple. "What do you make of him, Miss Marple?" "Dolly tells me you knew his uncle." "I knew Canon Prescott," said Miss Marple carefully. "And I knew his nephew, Edward Armitage, but whether this gentleman is that same Edward Armitage is another question entirely." The doctor's eyebrows rose. "You suspect fraud?" "I suspect nothing," said Miss Marple, which was not entirely true. "But I observed certain discrepancies." She was about to elaborate when a heavy thud sounded from directly above their heads. It was followed by a moment of complete silence. then by the sound of something rolling across a wooden floor. Dr. Haydock was on his feet instantly, moving with a speed surprising in a man of his age and build. The others followed him up the stairs to the blue room, where they found the door slightly ajar. Gray lay on the carpet beside the bed, his body rigid, his face fixed in an expression that was almost surprise. One hand was flung out, the fingers curled. Near his head lay a small glass bottle with a ground stopper. Haydock knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse at the throat, then at the wrist. After a long moment, he sat back on his heels and shook his head. "Dead?" whispered Miss Vale, her hand pressed to her mouth. "I'm afraid so." The doctor's voice was grim. "Looks like a sudden seizure, heart most likely, or possibly a stroke." He mentioned having nerves. Poor devil, that often indicates a cardiovascular weakness. Dolly had gone quite pale. "How dreadful, and in my house. Should I telephone Inspector Slack?" "I'll do that," said Haydock, rising. "Though in a case like this, a simple certification should suffice. Still, it's best to follow proper procedure." He glanced at Miss Marple, who had moved close to the body and now stood looking down at it with a peculiar intentness. "Miss Marple, are you quite all right?" "Perfectly, thank you, doctor." She bent down, and before anyone could stop her, she had picked up the small bottle that lay near Gray's head. She removed the stopper and held it to her nose, inhaling delicately. "Miss Marple, I hardly think—" began the doctor, but she had already replaced the stopper and was examining the bottle itself, turning it this way and that in the lamplight. "Sal volatile," she murmured, "or so the label declares. Yet the smell is rather unusual, wouldn't you say, doctor?" Haydock took the bottle from her with some reluctance and sniffed cautiously at the contents. His expression changed. "That's odd," he admitted. "Sal volatile should smell purely of ammonia, sharp, pungent, unmistakable. But this has something else, something almost sweet underneath the ammonia." He sniffed again, more carefully. "Good Lord, unless I'm very much mistaken, that's bitter almond." "Bitter almond?" repeated Dolly blankly. "Like marzipan?" "Like prussic acid," said Haydock grimly. "Also known as hydrocyanic acid, also known as one of the fastest-acting poisons known to man." There was a moment of shocked silence. Miss Vale gave a small moan and sank into a chair. Dolly stood frozen, her hand at her throat. Dr. Haydock carefully set the bottle on the bedside table and turned to face them. "I'm afraid Inspector Slack will need to be informed after all. This is no natural death. This is murder." Miss Marple said nothing, but her gaze had shifted from the bottle to the label affixed to its side. It was a neat label written in precise copperplate script. "Sal volatile for nervous disorders. Take as needed." The label looked remarkably clean and fresh for something that had supposedly traveled from Cape Town in a gentleman's luggage. The corners were sharp, uncreased. The adhesive showed no signs of age or discoloration. She moved her attention to the stopper itself. It was made of ground glass, fitted tightly into the neck of the bottle, with a small disc of paper beneath it to ensure a proper seal. The paper disc was visible through the clear glass, and Miss Marple noticed, with the sharp observation that had made her famous in certain circles, that it bore a tiny hole, no larger than a pinprick, precisely in its center. "May I examine the stopper more closely, doctor?" she asked. Haydock, who had been about to leave the room to telephone, paused. "I suppose so, though we should disturb the scene as little as possible." Miss Marple carefully removed the stopper from the bottle and held it up to the light. The paper disc beneath showed not only the pinprick hole, but also a faint wetness around its edges, as though it had recently been dampened and dried. "Most interesting," she said softly. "What is?" demanded Dolly, who had recovered somewhat from her shock. "The method," said Miss Marple. Sal volatile is kept in a sealed bottle because ammonia is volatile, as the name suggests. It evaporates. The paper disc beneath the stopper maintains the seal. But if someone were to pierce that disc with, say, a fine needle or bodkin and introduce a small quantity of another substance, the ammonia vapors and the new substance would mingle. When the unfortunate user lifted the bottle to his nose and inhaled deeply, as one does with smelling salts, he would take the poison directly into his lungs. Haydock stared at her. By George, I believe you're right. The delivery would be almost instantaneous. Death would follow within seconds. But who could have done such a thing? Cried Miss Vale. The poor man only arrived this afternoon. He can't have had any enemies here. Miss Marple replaced the stopper with careful precision. That, she said quietly, is precisely the question we must answer, though I suspect the answer may lie not in who Mr. Gray was, but in who he was not. She turned to Dolly. You mentioned that Mr. Somerton, the solicitor, was to be consulted about the codicil. Had you contacted him yet? Why, yes, I telephoned him this afternoon after Mr. Gray arrived. He said he would come round tomorrow morning to discuss the matter. He seemed most interested in the case. I'm sure he did, murmured Miss Marple. She glanced at the bottle once more, at its crisp label and fresh appearance. Most interested indeed. Dr. Haydock moved toward the door. I must telephone Slack immediately. Miss Marple, I think you'd better come down with us. I have a feeling the inspector is going to want to hear everything you've observed. As they left the blue room, Miss Marple paused in the doorway and looked back at the scene. The body on the floor, the overturned chair, the innocent-looking bottle on the bedside table. Bitter almond where only ammonia should be, she said softly. How very careless. Or perhaps how very clever, depending on one's point of view. But whether she meant the poisoner or the victim, no one could quite tell. Chapter 4. The Stamp That Came Too Late. Inspector Slack arrived at Gossington Hall shortly before midnight, bringing with him Constable Polk and an air of profound irritation at being called out at such an hour. He was a large, red-faced man who had long since resigned himself to the fact that in St. Mary Mead, violent death had an unfortunate tendency to occur in the most inconvenient places and at the most inconvenient times. Another body at Gossington, he announced to no one in particular. If it's not in the library, it's in a bedroom. What is it about this house, Lady Bantry? I'm sure I have no idea, Inspector, said Dolly with what dignity she could muster. This is hardly my fault. The poor man simply arrived and died. Except he didn't simply die, Slack pointed out. Dr. Haydock tells me it's poison. Prussic acid in his smelling salts, of all things. He turned to Miss Marple, who sat quietly in her corner with her knitting. And you've been poking about the evidence, I understand. I merely observed certain peculiarities, Inspector, said Miss Marple mildly. The bottle appeared to have been tampered with. Slack grunted. He had learned over several previous cases that Miss Marple's observations were generally worth listening to. However much it galled him to admit it. Well, you'd better tell me everything from the beginning, mind, and no leaving bits out. The account took some time. Dolly explained about the attic discovery, the sealed envelope, and Gray's arrival claiming to be Edward Armitage. Miss Marple described the inconsistencies in Gray's account, the mistake about Canon Prescott's limp, the confusion over names. Dr. Haydock detailed his examination of the body and the suspicious bottle. When they had finished, Slack sat back and rubbed his chin. So, we've got a man pretending to be someone he's not, come to claim money on a fraudulent codicil, who gets himself murdered before he can carry it through. That about sum it up? Substantially, yes, agreed Miss Marple. Right. Then first thing tomorrow we'll need to verify this codicil business. Lady Bantry, you said you were going to contact a solicitor, Mr. Somerton from Market Basing. He's coming at 10 now? He is now? Well, We'll want a word with him as well. Slack made a note. In the meantime, I'll need to examine this envelope and whatever else was found with it. Dolly fetched the items from her escritoire. The sealed envelope, now opened, lay beside the dance cards and the small velvet box containing the half-sixpence. Slack examined each item with methodical care, holding them up to the light and peering at them through a magnifying glass he produced from his pocket. It was Miss Marple who spoke first. "Inspector, might I suggest you examine the postage stamp on that envelope rather carefully?" Slack looked at her with suspicion. "The stamp? What about it?" "Only that it appears to be a Queen Victoria stamp from the period when the envelope was supposedly sealed, 1896, according to the inscription." "Well, what of it?" "Looks right to me. Queen's head, proper color." "Indeed." Miss Marple set down her knitting and approached the table. "But you see, Inspector, I had a great-uncle who was a philatelist, quite passionate about it. In fact, he taught me to recognize various issues in printings. This particular design, unless I am very much mistaken, was not issued until 1897. The watermark is wrong for 1896 as well." Slack peered at the stamp more closely. "How can you possibly tell that?" "The corner ornaments are different. The 1896 issue had a simpler design. This one has the additional flourishes that were added in the 1897 printing. As for the watermark, if you hold it up to the light at the proper angle, you should be able to see that it's from a later series altogether, 1901, I believe." Dr. Haydock moved to look over Slack's shoulder. "By Jove, I think she's right. Look there, that marking in the upper left." Slack's face had taken on an even deeper shade of red. "So what you're telling me is that this envelope dated 1896 has a stamp that didn't exist in 1896 and paper from 1901. That would appear to be the case," said Miss Marple apologetically. "Which means the whole thing is a forgery. A rather clumsy one, I'm afraid. Someone went to considerable trouble to create an authentic-looking document, but overlooked certain technical details that a true expert would notice immediately." Slack turned the envelope over, examining the wax seal with renewed interest. "What about this seal, then? Does that look wrong, too?" Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, a gesture those who knew her recognized as indicating deep thought. "I couldn't say with certainty, Inspector. Wax seals are not my particular area of expertise. However, I do notice that when one holds it at an angle, there appears to be a certain regularity to the impression that suggests it might have been made with a modern tool rather than an authentic seal ring." "The edges are perhaps a bit too precise? A modern tool?" repeated Slack. "You mean like a stamp?" "Possibly, or perhaps cast from a mold. There are ways to reproduce these things, I understand, though the results are rarely perfect under close examination." Slack set down the envelope with a sound of disgust. "So we've got a forged codicil, a dead imposter, and somebody clever enough to set all this up, but not clever enough to get the details right. What I want to know is who benefits from all this." "That," said Miss Marple, "is indeed the question, though I think we must also ask who had the knowledge to create such a forgery in the first place. Not everyone would know what Victorian stamps looked like, or how to reproduce copperplate handwriting, or where to obtain period paper." "Someone educated," mused Dr. Haydock. "Someone with access to resources," added Miss Marple. "Or someone who works closely with such things, a solicitor perhaps. Or a solicitor's clerk, someone who handles old documents regularly and would know how they should appear." Slack's eyes narrowed. "This Mr. Somerton you mentioned, Lady Bantry, what do you know about him?" "Very little, really. He's been in market basing for perhaps 5 years. Handles estate matters, wills, that sort of thing. Always seemed perfectly respectable." "Respectable?" Slack snorted. "I've known plenty of respectable people who turned out to be anything but. We'll have a very careful conversation with Mr. Somerton tomorrow. He gathered up the documents. These will need to be examined by experts, but I'm willing to bet Miss Marple's right about the lot of them being forgeries. There is one other thing, Inspector, said Miss Marple quietly. Mr. Gray claimed he had written several letters to me after he left St. Mary Mead in 1896, yet I never received any such letters. At the time, I assumed simply that he had forgotten about me, as young men do. But now I wonder whether those letters ever existed at all. You think he was lying about that too? I think whoever was coaching him in his role gave him certain facts, but didn't account for every detail. The letters would have been a nice touch, explaining the long silence, but they would also have been difficult to produce as evidence. Slack closed his notebook with a snap. Right, so tomorrow we talk to this Somerton fellow, and we find out exactly how involved he is in this mess. Because if he helped create these forgeries, he might well have decided his accomplice was too much of a liability once the fraud started to unravel. That seems entirely possible, agreed Miss Marple. She resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the quiet room. Though I think we must also consider that Mr. Gray, or whatever his real name was, may have had other associates, someone who knew enough about the plan to prepare that poisoned bottle, someone patient and clever and perhaps rather ruthless. A woman, you mean? Said Slack bluntly. Miss Marple looked up, her blue eyes very clear. I didn't say that, Inspector. But it is true that the tampering with the sal volatile bottle required a certain delicacy of touch and a certain domestic knowledge of how such things are prepared and labeled. These are merely observations, of course. Slack grunted again. Observations, right? Well, we'll see what tomorrow brings. In the meantime, nobody leaves Gossington Hall without my permission. That clear? It was perfectly clear. And as Miss Marple climbed the stairs to her room an hour later, she found herself thinking about stamps and seals, and the curious fact that fraud, like murder, so often unraveled because someone forgot that the smallest details mattered most of all. Chapter 5. The Sixpence with a Modern Cut. Morning came to Gossington Hall with that peculiar hush that settles over a house where sudden death has visited. The servants moved quietly through their duties, speaking in whispers. Dolly Bantry came down to breakfast, looking as though she had slept poorly, which indeed she had. Miss Marple, by contrast, appeared remarkably fresh for someone who had been up until well past 1 house. She sat at the breakfast table with her usual cup of weak tea and a single piece of toast, though her attention was not on either. Instead, she was examining the small velvet box that Dolly had retrieved from the drawing room. I do wish you wouldn't brood over that wretched thing, said Dolly, pouring herself a second cup of coffee with a hand that trembled slightly. It's brought nothing but trouble. On the contrary, my dear, I believe it may provide answers. Miss Marple opened the box and lifted out the half-sixpence that had belonged to her all those years ago. May I borrow your reading glass, Dolly? Dolly fetched it from the escritoire, and Miss Marple held the coin fragment under its magnification, turning it this way and that in the morning sunlight that streamed through the window. You see, she said after a moment, how the edge is quite irregular, small nicks and burrs where the metal was cut. A penknife, I remember, and not a very sharp one. Edward fumbled with it dreadfully. He was never good with his hands for such delicate work. I remember you mentioned that yesterday, said Dolly. But what difference does it make now? All the difference in the world. Miss Marple set down the genuine half and held up the one that Gray had carried. This one, you see, shows quite a different character. The edges are remarkably straight and clean. Look here, these tiny parallel marks running around the circumference. Those are from a jeweler's wheel, or perhaps a small grinding tool. Very modern, very precise. This was not cut by a clumsy young man with a penknife on a terrace step in 1896. Dolly leaned forward, her fatigue momentarily forgotten. You mean Gray's sixpence was a fake, too? I mean that whoever prepared Mr. Gray for his imposture went to considerable trouble to provide him with convincing props. They obtained a genuine sixpence of the right vintage and cut it in half. But they used modern tools to do so, never thinking that someone might remember exactly how the original was cut. But how could they know about the sixpence at all? Surely that was just between you and Edward. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. That is indeed troubling. Very few people knew about it. I mentioned it to no one at the time, and I'm quite certain Edward would have been equally discreet. Yet someone knew. Someone had access to that particular piece of information. Before Dolly could respond, Collins entered to announce that Miss Vale had arrived and begged a moment of Lady Bantry's time. The young woman who entered the breakfast room looked even more nervous than usual. She twisted her hands together and barely managed a greeting before bursting out with her news. Lady Bantry, Miss Marple, I must tell you something. I couldn't sleep last night thinking about it, and I'm sure it's important. Though perhaps I shouldn't say anything because she's been so kind. But with Mr. Gray dead and the inspector asking questions, I really feel I must. Do calm yourself, Miss Vale, said Dolly kindly. Sit down and catch your breath. Whatever it is, I'm sure it will keep long enough for you to tell us coherently. Miss Vale accepted a cup of tea with shaking hands and took a fortifying sip. It's about Mrs. Carraway, Mr. Somerton's housekeeper. She was here yesterday afternoon. Here? Dolly looked surprised. I don't recall Collins mentioning any visitors besides Mr. Gray. That's just it. She didn't come to the front door. I was in the attic, you see, cataloging those hat boxes we found in the corner, and I happened to look out the window. I saw her coming up the drive, but instead of approaching the main entrance, she went round to the side toward the servants' entrance. Perhaps she had business with our housekeeper, suggested Dolly. I thought that too at first, but then I saw her again about half an hour later. She was leaving by the same route, and she looked, well, furtive is the only word for it. She kept glancing back at the house as though afraid of being seen. Miss Marple set down her teacup with great care. What time was this, Miss Vale? It must have been around 4 just after Mr. Gray arrived, I think. I remember hearing voices downstairs and assuming you were entertaining him. And you're certain it was Mrs. Carraway? Quite certain. She helped us at the museum last year with some paperwork. Very efficient woman, always so neat and particular about everything. She has rather distinctive features, a sharp nose and very erect posture. Miss Marple and Dolly exchanged glances. Miss Vale, said Miss Marple gently, can you tell us anything else about Mrs. Carraway? Her position with Mr. Somerton, for instance. She's been his housekeeper for several years, I believe. Some people in the village say she's more of a companion than a servant, if you know what I mean. Mr. Somerton is a widower, and Mrs. Carraway manages his household entirely. She's very protective of him, some say overly so. Protective, murmured Miss Marple. How interesting. At that moment, Inspector Slack was announced. He entered with the air of a man who has already been up for several hours and has much to accomplish before lunch. Lady Bantry, Miss Marple, good morning. I've just been examining Mr. Gray's effects from his room. Found something you'll want to see. He produced a small evidence bag containing a man's shirt cuff. Notice anything unusual? Miss Marple took the bag and held it to the light. On the inner surface of the cuff was a small mark in blue chalk, very faint but still visible. A tailor's mark, she said, used for fitting adjustments. Exactly. And I've just been to every tailor in a 20-mile radius. This particular mark belongs to Fellows and Son in Market Basing. They do all of Mr. Somerton's suits. Slack's expression was grimly satisfied. The same Mr. Somerton who's due here in less than an hour to discuss that forged codicil. How very careless, observed Miss Marple. Though I suspect Mr. Gray, or whatever his real name was, had no idea his clothing would give him away. People so often overlook these small domestic details. Domestic details? Repeated Slack. Speaking of which, said Miss Marple, I'd like a word with your staff. Lady Bantry, particularly anyone who was working in the vicinity of Mr. Gray's room yesterday evening. As Slack departed to interview the servants, Miss Vale made her excuses and fled, clearly overwhelmed by the morning's revelations. Miss Marple remained at the table, the 2 half-sixpences laid out before her like evidence in a trial. Jane, said Dolly quietly, do you think Mrs. Carroway killed him? I think, said Miss Marple, picking up the false sixpence and examining its too perfect edge once more, that Mrs. Carroway is a woman who takes great pride in doing things properly. Labels, measurements, neat appearances. Such people can be very dangerous when they decide that tidying up loose ends includes disposing of inconvenient accomplices. She set down the coin with a soft click. And Mr. Gray, I fear, had become exceedingly inconvenient indeed. Chapter 6. 2 Hands. 1 Letter. Mr. Charles Somerton arrived at Gossington Hall precisely at 10 as promised. He was a man of perhaps 50, sleek and well-groomed, with a kind of smooth assurance that comes from years of dealing with the anxieties and complications of other people's affairs. His suit was beautifully cut, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his manner conveyed just the right blend of professional sympathy and businesslike efficiency. Lady Bantry, what a terrible tragedy. I came as soon as I received your message about poor Mr. Gray's sudden passing. Most distressing. He paused in the act of removing his gloves. Though I confess I'm somewhat puzzled by the presence of the police. Surely this was a natural death. Inspector Slack, who had been waiting in the drawing room with Dolly and Miss Marple, stepped forward. That's what we're trying to determine, Mr. Somerton. I'm Inspector Slack. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your connection to the deceased. Somerton's eyebrows rose. My connection? I had no connection whatsoever. I was simply engaged by Lady Bantry to provide legal advice regarding a codicil discovered among her late mother-in-law's papers. Funny. Thing about that codicil, said Slack. Turns out it's a forgery. Wrong stamps, wrong paper, wrong everything. The color drained from Somerton's face with gratifying speed. Forgery? But that's impossible. I haven't even examined the documents yet. No, but your housekeeper examined them yesterday afternoon, said Slack smoothly. Mrs. Carroway. She paid a visit to Gossington Hall while Mr. Gray was having tea with Lady Bantry. Went round to the servants' entrance, very quiet-like. Care to explain that? Somerton sat down rather abruptly in the nearest chair. Mrs. Carroway was here? I had no knowledge of that, none whatsoever. Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly with her knitting, spoke for the first time. Mr. Somerton, I wonder if you might look at something for me. It's rather a small matter, but it's been troubling me. She produced the sealed envelope and its contents, spreading them on the table. This is the codicil in question. You'll notice the witness signature at the bottom, the initials E.A. Somerton leaned forward, professional interest momentarily overcoming his obvious discomfort. Yes, I see it. What about it? Would you say that both letters were written by the same hand? The solicitor examined the signature more closely, pulling out a pair of reading spectacles. After a long moment, he frowned. Now that you mention it, no. The E has a certain confident flourish, quite firm and decisive. But the A trails off rather weakly. Different pressure, different angle. He looked up. 2 people signed this. That would be my conclusion, said Miss Marple. Slack pulled out his notebook. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Mr. Somerton, where were you yesterday evening between 7 and 11 die? At my office in Market Basing until 8, then at home for the remainder of the evening. Mrs. Carroway can vouch for my whereabouts. I'm sure she can, said Slack dryly, being as how she works for you and all. Anyone else see you? Somerton's jaw tightened. My clerk left at 6. After that, it was just Mrs. Carraway and myself. Inspector, I must protest this line of questioning. I am a respectable solicitor with an unblemished record. And Mr. Gray was wearing a shirt with your tailor's mark on it, said Slack flatly. Found it this morning, blue chalk tick inside the cuff. Very distinctive. Your man fellows confirmed it not an hour ago. The silence that followed was profound. Somerton's face had gone from pale to gray. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, had begun to tremble slightly. I can explain that, he said at last, his voice strained. I gave Gray some old shirts of mine. He arrived in London from the Cape with very little luggage, said his trunk had gone astray in customs. I felt sorry for him, offered him a few things until he could get properly fitted out. How generous, observed Miss Marple gently. And how did you come to meet Mr. Gray in the first place? Somerton hesitated, clearly weighing his options. He came to my office about a month ago, said he'd seen a notice I'd placed in the Times regarding the search for Edward Armitage or his heirs. He claimed to be Armitage and asked about pursuing the matter. And you believed him? He had documentation, letters, a photograph, that broken sixpence. It all seemed legitimate. Did Mrs. Carraway meet him during this visit? Asked Miss Marple. Yes, she brought us tea. Why do you ask? Only that I'm curious about the letters Mr. Gray supposedly had. Might I see them? Somerton reached into his briefcase with obvious reluctance and produced several folded sheets. These are copies. Gray kept the originals. Miss Marple took the papers and held them up to the window light, examining them with the same careful attention she had given everything else. The others watched in silence as she turned each sheet, studying not just the writing but the paper itself. How very clever, she murmured, and yet how careless. You see here, Dolly, where the paper has been pressed? There's an impression beneath the written text, very faint, as though the sheet had been laid atop another page during writing. She angled the paper so Dolly could see. Sure enough, when caught in the right light, ghost letters appeared beneath the handwritten script. Typewriter impressions, said Dolly, from the paper underneath. Precisely. These letters were written recently, placed over typewritten drafts to ensure the wording was correct, then pressed hard enough to leave traces. No one in 1896 would have had access to a typewriter for personal correspondence of this nature, and certainly not for love letters from a curate's nephew. Slack took the letters and examined them himself. So these are forgeries, too. The whole thing was a setup from start to finish. Somerton had gone very still. Inspector, I swear to you, I had no idea these documents were false. Gray came to me, presented his case, and I agreed to help him pursue what seemed a legitimate claim. If I've been duped, then I'm as much a victim as anyone. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, though I wonder about something else. She picked up one of the letters again. Mr. Gray told us yesterday that Edward Armitage always wrote the word today with a hyphen, the old-fashioned manner. Yet this letter, supposedly written by Armitage in 1896, uses the modern spelling, no hyphen at all. She set down the letter and looked directly at Somerton. Someone coached Mr. Gray very thoroughly about his role. They provided him with props and background information, but they forgot that small habits of writing change over time, and that paper can remember what happened to it, even when people cannot. Somerton said nothing. His smooth facade had cracked completely, revealing beneath it a man who looked suddenly much older and considerably more frightened. I think, said Inspector Slack, rising to his feet, that you and I need to have a much longer conversation. Mr. Somerton, down at the station, where we can be more comfortable. And I'll be sending a man to bring in Mrs. Carraway as well. Something tells me she'll have quite a lot to say about all this. As Slack led Somerton away, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, though her needles moved slowly, thoughtfully. 2 hands completing one signature, she said to Dolly. Like partners in a dance, each playing their part. But in this case, the dance led to murder, and I very much fear we haven't yet identified all the dancers. Chapter 7. Hyphen into day. The afternoon brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the grounds of Gossington Hall gray and melancholy. Miss Marple sat in the blue room, the scene of the previous night's tragedy, having asked Dolly's permission to examine it once more in daylight. Collins had tidied the space that morning under Inspector Slack's supervision, but the essential character of the room remained unchanged. Miss Marple moved slowly about, her keen eyes taking in details that others might have missed. The wastebasket beside the writing desk particularly interested her. She bent down, peering into its depths. Most of the contents had been removed by the police, but a few scraps remained. Using a pencil from the desk, she carefully extracted a small piece of paper, no larger than a postage stamp. It was the backing from a gummed label, the kind used for bottles and jars. On its reverse side, someone had written in pencil, SV for nerves. The paper had a faint almond smell that Miss Marple recognized immediately. She had encountered it in furniture polish, in certain confections, and most recently in the vapors, from a poisoned bottle. Bitter. Almond, she folded the scrap carefully into a handkerchief and continued her examination. Gray's suitcase stood in the corner where the police had left it after searching through its contents. Miss Marple opened it, finding the usual items one would expect: a change of linen, a shaving kit, a book of poetry, and at the bottom, tucked into a side pocket, a small leather notebook. The police had evidently deemed it unimportant, for it remained untouched. Miss Marple carried it to the window where the light was better and began to page through it. Most entries were mundane: appointments, addresses, brief notations about weather and travel, but toward the back she found something that made her pause. A page had been torn out, not cleanly but raggedly, as though removed in haste. The remaining stub showed the impression of writing from the missing page. She held it to the light, tilting it at various angles. Gradually, words emerged. Caraway says Thursday evening safest. And below that, must remember limp and Clarissa mistake. Miss Marple sat down in the chair by the window, the notebook open in her lap. So Gray had known about his errors. Someone, presumably Mrs. Caraway, had warned him. Yet he had made the mistakes anyway, perhaps through nervousness, or simply because remembering a fabricated past was more difficult than he had anticipated. There was a soft knock at the door, and Dr. Haydock entered, rain glistening on his coat. "Miss Marple, Lady Bantry said I'd find you here." Slack telephoned. "He's been questioning Mrs. Caraway for the past 2 hours. "And has she proved cooperative?" "Remarkably silent, according to Slack. Won't say a word without her solicitor present." "And given that her solicitor is currently helping police with their own inquiries, that's proving complicated." Haydock moved to the window, looking out at the rain. He did find something interesting at Somerton's house, though. A whole drawer full of labels exactly like the one on that sal volatile bottle. Same paper stock, same size, same everything. "How very methodical of someone," observed Miss Marple. "There's more." The housekeeper's room has what Slack describes as a complete apothecary setup: bottles, measuring devices, labels, all arranged with military precision. The woman's apparently passionate about herbal remedies and tonics. Makes them herself for various ailments, including nervous disorders. "Including nervous disorders," Miss Marple repeated. Slack found a recipe book with all sorts of concoctions listed, sal volatile features prominently. Miss Marple showed him the scrap of label backing she had discovered. Then this likely came from her workspace as well. The initials SV would stand for sal volatile, I presume. Haydock sniffed the paper and nodded. That's bitter almond, same smell as the bottle. She must have been using furniture polish with almond oil near her label-making station, transferred to the adhesive backing. How very careless of her, said Miss Marple, though perhaps she didn't expect anyone to look in a wastebasket. She showed him the notebook next, pointing out the torn page and its faint impressions. Haydock read them with a low whistle. So Carraway was coaching him, warning him about mistakes he might make, but he made them anyway. People under pressure rarely perform as well as they hope, said Miss Marple. Mr. Gray was nervous from the start. His hands trembled at dinner, and he retired early, pleading exhaustion. I think perhaps he was beginning to doubt the wisdom of the entire scheme. Doubt enough to back out, possibly, which would have been very inconvenient for his partners. A man having second thoughts becomes a liability, Haydock said. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, watching the rain. You think Carraway killed him to keep him quiet? I think Mrs. Carraway is a woman who values order and control. She creates her remedies with precision, labels everything neatly, maintains Mr. Somerton's household with exacting standards. Such people do not tolerate loose ends. Miss Marple closed the notebook gently. Mr. Gray was becoming a very loose end indeed. But how did she manage it? She wasn't here at dinner. She wasn't in the house when he died, was she? Miss Marple's voice was very soft. Miss Vale saw her leaving by the servants' entrance at 4 wide, but did anyone see her arrive? And more importantly, did anyone verify that she actually left the premises? Haydock stared at her. You think she hid somewhere in the house? I think it would have been quite simple to slip in during the afternoon confusion, make her way to Gray's room while everyone was at tea, and exchange his sal volatile for a poison duplicate. The bottle would have looked identical. Gray would have suspected nothing. When his nerves overcame him that evening, he reached for his remedy and inhaled death. Good God, the woman's a monster. The woman is practical, corrected Miss Marple. In her mind, she was solving a problem. Mr. Gray knew too much and was proving unreliable. Mr. Somerton could be managed, but Gray was an outsider, potentially dangerous. So she eliminated the danger with the same efficiency she applies to household management. She rose, tucking the notebook and the label backing into her handbag. I believe we should share these findings with Inspector Slack. And there's one more thing I'd like to examine if it's possible. What's that? Mr. Gray's shirt cuffs, all of them. I noticed yesterday that the one bearing the tailor's mark was quite clean. But a man traveling from London, nervous and perspiring, would surely have soiled his cuffs somewhat, unless, of course, they were provided to him quite recently, perhaps even here in this room shortly before dinner. Haydock's eyes widened with understanding. You think Carraway brought him a fresh shirt as part of her visit? I think Mrs. Carraway is very thorough in her preparations. She would want her accomplice looking respectable and confident. Fresh linen would be part of ensuring everything appeared exactly as it should. Miss Marple moved toward the door. Unfortunately for her, she forgot that respectable appearances can sometimes reveal more than ragged ones. Mr. Somerton's tailor's mark proved most illuminating. As they descended the stairs, Miss Marple paused, her hand on the banister. Doctor, when you examined Mr. Gray's body, did you notice anything unusual about his fingernails? His fingernails? Can't say I paid particular attention. Why? Only that a man who had supposedly spent decades in South Africa working in trade and business would likely show some signs of manual labor. Calluses, perhaps, or roughened skin. Yet Mr. Gray's hands were quite soft, rather like an actor's hands or a gentleman of leisure. You knew he was a fraud from the very beginning, didn't you? Miss Marple smiled, her gentle smile. I knew Edward Armitage, and that man, whoever he was not Edward. The real Edward whistled Annie Laurie quite dreadfully flat, especially on the second bar. Mr. Gray, When Dolly hummed that tune yesterday, continued it perfectly on pitch. Small things. Doctor, but telling ones. She continued down the stairs, leaving Haydock to follow, marveling once again at the elderly spinster's extraordinary capacity for observation. And the quiet, inexorable logic with which she assembled her evidence. Chapter 8. Alibis over Sherry. Inspector Slack returned to Gossington Hall shortly before tea, looking considerably less irritated than when he departed that morning with Mr. Somerton in tow. He accepted Dolly's offer of refreshment and settled into an armchair with the air of a man who had things to report. "Somerton's talking," he announced without preamble. "Singing like a canary once he realized how deep he was in." "How convenient for him," observed Miss Marple, pouring tea with steady hands. "That's what I thought, too. But his story has a ring of truth to it, or at least partial truth. According to Somerton, Caraway came to him about 2 months ago with what she called a business opportunity. She discovered that old codicil while helping him organize his files of unclaimed estates." "The real codicil?" asked Dolly. "There was a real codicil, apparently, properly executed, proper witness, the works. Only the witness had emigrated years ago and was presumed dead. No way to verify his identity. No way to claim the money for the library fund. The whole thing was just gathering dust in Somerton's files." Miss Marple set down her cup. "And Mrs. Caraway suggested finding someone to impersonate the witness. Got it in one. She told Somerton she knew an out-of-work actor in London, fellow who'd do anything for a bit of money. They could coach him, provide him with enough details to pass muster, claim the legacy, and split it 3 ways after paying out a small portion for the library." "3 ways?" repeated Dr. Haydock, who had joined them. "Greedy, the lot of them. Greed makes people careless," said Miss Marple. "They focus on the reward and forget the risks. Slack helped himself to a biscuit. Somerton swears he never intended fraud. Says Caraway convinced him it was essentially a victimless crime. The money would go to the library eventually, just with a bit taken off the top for their trouble. He provided the old shirts, gave the actor coaching sessions, helped forge the supporting documents. But he didn't commit murder," said Miss Marple quietly. "He swears he didn't. Says he was horrified when he heard Gray was dead. Claimed he'd been at his office until 8 last evening working on estate papers, then went straight home." "And Mrs. Caraway?" Slack's expression darkened. "She's sticking to her story. Says she was with Somerton the entire evening. Left his office at 8, drove him home, prepared his dinner, spent the evening mending in the parlor, never left the house. Yet she was seen here yesterday afternoon," Dolly pointed out. "She admits to that now. Says she came to deliver some papers Somerton had forgotten and didn't want to disturb Lady Bantry during a tea party. Claimed she handed them to one of the servants and left immediately." Miss Marple turned to Dolly. "Did any of the servants mention receiving papers from Mrs. Caraway?" "I asked Colin specifically this morning. He knew nothing about it. Neither did any of the others." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple. Slack leaned forward. "Here's where it gets complicated. I've been reconstructing the timeline for yesterday evening. Somerton admits he came here himself around 7. He was here?" Dolly looked startled. "I don't recall that at all." "You wouldn't. He says he came to the servants' entrance hoping to collect those papers he'd supposedly sent with Caraway earlier. Wanted to look over the codicil before his official visit this morning. He spoke briefly with your footman James, who told him you were entertaining and couldn't be disturbed. Somerton left without seeing you." "James mentioned no such visit to me," said Dolly with considerable annoyance. "The lad's been questioned," confirmed Somerton's story. The solicitor seemed agitated, kept asking whether Mr. Gray had retired yet. When James said Gray was still in the drawing room, Somerton left. Miss Marple's needles had stilled in her lap. What time did Mr. Somerton arrive and depart? Arrived at 7:30, left by 8 hours. James is quite certain of the times because he was watching the clock, waiting to go off duty. And where was Mrs. Carraway during this visit? That's the question, isn't it? Slack pulled out his notebook. Somerton says she waited in his motor car. It was parked around the side near the kitchen garden. She didn't come to the door with him. Did anyone see her in the car? Asked Dr. Haydock. That's what I've been trying to establish. I've questioned all your staff, Lady Bantry. Your cook stepped out for some air around 7:45 and noticed a motor car parked where Somerton said, but she didn't see anyone inside. Too dark by then. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her movements were slow, thoughtful. Inspector, what time did we discover Mr. Gray's body? You called down at 10:30. Dr. Haydock estimates death occurred within minutes of that time based on body temperature and rigor. So between Mr. Somerton's departure at 8:00 and our discovery at 10:30, there was a window of 2.5 hours during which time Gray was alive and presumably in his room. Several people saw him go upstairs around 9 hours. He complained of nerves, said he needed to lie down, and his sal volatile. According to Miss Vale, who passed him in the hallway, he was carrying it in his hand, said something about needing it close by. Dolly shuddered. The poor man carried his own death with him. The question, said Slack heavily, is who gave it to him in the first place. Somerton swears the bottle was Gray's own, brought from London. Carraway claimed she never touched it. Gray himself is dead and can't tell us. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. Inspector, you mentioned that your cook stepped outside around 7:45. Did she happen to notice anything else? Anyone moving about the grounds, perhaps? Slack consulted his notes. She mentioned seeing someone near the back door, thought it was one of the housemaids at first, but when she called out, the figure moved away quickly. She assumed it was a tradesman's girl taking a shortcut home. A figure in a dress, said Miss Marple. How interesting. And this would have been while Mr. Somerton was still speaking with James at the servants' entrance. Shortly after, yes. Then Mrs. Carraway was not in the motor car at all. She was in the house. The room fell silent. Slack stared at Miss Marple, his expression arrested. She couldn't have been. Somerton said she waited in the car. Mr. Somerton said many things that proved untrue. Why should we believe him about this? Miss Marple picked up her teacup, found it cold, and set it down again. Consider, Inspector. Mrs. Carraway arrives with Mr. Somerton. While he engages James at the door, she slips into the house through another entrance. The kitchen door, perhaps, or one of the side entries. She knows the layout from her earlier visit. She goes upstairs, finds Mr. Gray's room, and exchanges his sal volatile for the poison duplicate she has prepared. But Gray was still downstairs at that hour, objected Haydock. In the drawing room with Lady Bantry. Precisely, which meant his room was empty and his belongings unguarded. Mrs. Carraway could complete her business in minutes. She slips back outside. Your cook catches a glimpse of her retreating figure, and by the time Mr. Somerton returns to the car, she's safely waiting inside. Her mission accomplished. Slack had gone very still. And when Gray reaches for his salts later that evening, believing them to be his own trusted remedy, he inhales poison. Instead, a bottle labeled in Mrs. Carraway's distinctive hand, added Miss Marple, with her arm, and scented furniture polish transferred to the label, backing with a paper seal pierced by her bodkin to introduce the poison. She made a great many mistakes for someone so careful, but then she was working under pressure and in haste. Right, said Slack, rising abruptly. I'm going back to the station. Mrs. Carraway has some new questions to answer, and this time I won't be accepting her alibis quite so readily. After he had gone, Dolly turned to Miss Marple with something like awe. You've solved it, haven't you? You know exactly what happened. I know what the evidence suggests, said Miss Marple gently. "But there are still a few small details to confirm. The truth, my dear Dolly, is often found in the smallest details of all." Chapter 9. The Solicitor's Housekeeper and the Sal Volatile. The following morning brought Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, and Inspector Slack to the offices of Somerton and Phelps in Market Basing. The building was a respectable Georgian structure on the High Street, with brass plates polished to brilliance and windows that gleamed. In the weak April sunshine, Somerton himself was nowhere to be seen, being detained elsewhere at his Majesty's pleasure, but his elderly clerk, Mr. Tibbs, admitted them with obvious reluctance. The poor man looked as though he had aged a decade overnight, his employer's disgrace having shattered his faith in the orderly world of legal practice. "Mrs. Carraway's rooms are on the upper floor," he explained, leading them up a narrow staircase. "She keeps them very private. Mr. Somerton always said she was entitled to her domain, being such a treasure about the household management." The rooms proved to be exactly as Miss Marple had anticipated. Everything spoke of meticulous order and careful attention to detail. The sitting room was spotless, furniture arranged with geometric precision. The small kitchen gleamed, not a dish out of place, not a crumb on the counters, but it was the workroom that held their attention. One entire wall was devoted to shelves containing bottles of every size and description, each labeled in the same precise copperplate hand they had seen on the Sal Volatile file. A large table held various implements, measuring glasses, funnels, a mortar and pestle, cutting tools, and most significantly, a stack of blank-gummed labels identical to the one on Gray's bottle. Slack examined the labels closely. Same stock, same size, could have come from this very pile. Miss Marple had moved to a smaller table near the window, where a bottle of furniture polish sat beside a collection of pens and inks. She lifted the polish and inhaled carefully. "Almond oil," she confirmed. "The same scent that was on the label backing I found in Mr. Gray's wastebasket." Dr. Haydock was examining the array of bottles. "She's got quite a pharmacy here. Sal Volatile, laudanum, paregoric, chlorodyne, camphor spirits, all properly labeled and organized. Too organized." "Perhaps," murmured Miss Marple. She had opened a drawer in the work table and found a small notebook filled with recipes and measurements. "Look here. Sal Volatile for nervous complaints." She notes the precise proportions of ammonium carbonate and water, the proper method of sealing to prevent evaporation. Very thorough. Slack peered over her shoulder. "Anything about prussic acid?" "Not explicitly. But here, several pages further on, is a recipe for almond extract. She notes that bitter almonds must be handled with extreme care due to their toxic properties. And beside it, in brackets, she has written, 'Oil of bitter almond, 5 drops sufficient for strong effect.'" The inspector's face had darkened. She knew exactly what she was doing. In another drawer, Miss Marple found something even more telling. A slim bodkin, no more than 3 inches long, with a bone handle worn smooth from use. Its point was wickedly sharp, perfect for piercing paper seals on bottles. "May I?" She held it up to the light, then touched it delicately to her tongue before Haydock could protest. She wrinkled her nose. "There's a residue, sweet and slightly bitter. I believe this is the instrument used to introduce poison through the seal of Mr. Gray's bottle." "Good Lord, Miss Marple, you shouldn't taste evidence," exclaimed Haydock. "That could be dangerous." "The merest trace, Doctor. Hardly enough to cause harm, but quite enough to confirm its purpose." Slack had been going through the contents of a small escritoire in the corner. He pulled out a bundle of letters tied with ribbon and began reading through them. "These are from Somerton," he said after a moment. "Love letters, unless I miss my guess, rather fervent ones, too." He looked up. Seems our respectable solicitor and his housekeeper were considerably more than employer and employee. That explains a great deal, said Miss Marple. Mrs. Carraway would have been protecting not just her position, but her future. If the fraud succeeded, she and Mr. Somerton could have married on the proceeds, a tidy sum to set them up comfortably. And when Grace started making mistakes and getting nervous, added Haydock, she saw the whole scheme unraveling. Precisely. A nervous accomplice is a dangerous accomplice. Better to dispose of him and claim his share. Miss Marple moved to examine a calendar hanging on the wall. See here. She has marked last Thursday with a small cross, the day Mr. Gray was to arrive at Gossington Hall. Slack studied the calendar more closely. And look at this notation for Wednesday. Prepare remedy for J. That would be Gray's first name, whatever it really was. They found more evidence in Mrs. Carraway's bedroom. A reticule hanging on a hook contained, among other items, a second bodkin identical to the first, and a small vial of clear liquid that Haydock carefully stoppered and pocketed. This will need to be tested, he said. But I'd wager it's hydrocyanic acid or something very like it. The most damning discovery came last. Behind a stack of linens in the wardrobe, Miss Marple found a gentleman's shirt neatly folded. It bore the same blue chalk mark they had found on Gray's cuff, the distinctive sign of Fellows and Son. She brought him a fresh shirt, said Miss Marple, just as I suspected. Wanted him looking his best for his performance, but she forgot that the tailor's mark would link him directly to Mr. Somerton. Slack wrapped the shirt carefully. That's it then. Between the bodkin, the Polish, the labels, the shirts, and that vial, we've got her cold. The woman planned this murder down to the last detail. Except for the details that betrayed her, Miss Marple corrected gently. The almond scent on the label backing, the fresh appearance of the label itself, the pinhole in the seal, and the wetness from dampness around its edges. She was so focused on eliminating Mr. Gray that she failed to consider what traces she might leave behind. They descended the stairs in silence. Mr. Tibbs waited anxiously in the front office. "Will there be charges against the firm?" he asked, his voice trembling. "That's not for me to say," said Slack, not unkindly. "But you might want to start looking for new employment. Mr. Tibbs, I don't think Somerton and Phelps will be conducting much business for the foreseeable future." Outside, the morning had turned bright and clear. Miss Marple paused on the pavement, looking up at the windows of Mrs. Carraway's domain. She kept everything so neat, she observed, so carefully organized and controlled. But she forgot that murder is inherently untidy. One cannot plan for every contingency, cannot label and organize one's way out of the consequences of taking a life. "She'll hang for it," said Slack. "Bluntly, perhaps, or perhaps she'll spend her remaining years in prison. Keeping her cell as neat and orderly as that workroom upstairs," Miss Marple sighed. "Either way, her carefully ordered world has come to a very disorderly end." They returned to Gossington Hall to find that Mrs. Carraway had at last broken her silence. Faced with the mounting evidence from her rooms, she'd confessed to Inspector Slack's sergeant, not with remorse, the sergeant reported, but with a kind of cold practicality, as though explaining a domestic chore that had needed doing. She said Gray was going to ruin everything, the sergeant told them. Said he was too nervous, making too many mistakes. She decided he was more valuable dead than alive. Claimed it was a business decision. "A business decision?" repeated Dolly with horror. "The woman speaks of murder as though she were discussing housekeeping accounts." "To her mind," said Miss Marple softly, "it was housekeeping, tidying up a problem, disposing of something that had outlived its usefulness. That perhaps is the most chilling aspect of all." Chapter 10. Gossington. Letters. Sixpence and the Man Who Wasn't Ned. 3 days after Mrs. Carraway's arrest, The principals gathered once more in the morning room at Gossington Hall. The rain had finally cleared, and spring sunshine filled the room with warmth and light. It was, thought Miss Marple, a much more pleasant setting for the conclusion of a dark business than the blue room upstairs, which still carried an air of tragedy despite the housemaid's best efforts. Inspector Slack had requested the meeting to tie up loose ends, though Miss Marple suspected he also wanted an audience for the complete unraveling of the case. He had that look of satisfaction men get when they have solved a puzzle through diligent police work, even if a good portion of that solution had been supplied by an elderly lady with knitting needles. Dolly presided naturally, with tea and cakes arranged on the table. Miss Vale had been invited, as had Dr. Haydock and the Reverend Clement with his wife Griselda. It was only fair, Dolly had declared, that the village should hear the truth firsthand rather than through the distortions of gossip. Slack cleared his throat importantly. Right then. I thought you'd all want to know how this business sorted itself out. First off, the man calling himself Neville Gray was actually one James Kellaway, a stage actor who'd fallen on hard times. Mrs. Carraway found him through theatrical connections in London, promised him $50 to play the part of Edward Armitage for a few weeks. The poor man, murmured Mrs. Clement. He must have been desperate. Desperate enough to commit fraud. Certainly, though whether he knew his partners meant to kill him is another matter. We'll never know now. Slack consulted his notes. Somerton's been charged with conspiracy to defraud. He'll likely get 5 to 7 years. Claims he never intended violence, and I'm inclined to believe him. He is a fool and a scoundrel, but not a murderer. And Mrs. Carraway? Asked the Reverend Clement quietly. Charged with murder. The evidence is overwhelming. The poison bottle, the bodkin, the labels from her workroom, the almond-scented polish. She made the mistake of being too clever by half. Thought she could tidy up the loose end that was Kellaway, then marry Somerton on the proceeds. Miss Marple had been sitting quietly, her hands folded over her knitting. Now she spoke, her voice gentle but clear. If I might, Inspector, there are still a few matters that deserve explanation. For instance, how Mrs. Carraway and Mr. Somerton learned certain private details about my friendship with Edward Armitage, the blue shawl, the pressed carnation, the broken sixpence. These were not common knowledge, Slack nodded. That troubled me too. Turns out Somerton's predecessor in the firm, old Mr. Phelps, had been the Armitage family solicitor. His files contain letters from Canon Prescott mentioning his nephew's time in St. Mary Mead. One letter specifically described a dance at the vicarage and a certain young lady with a blue shawl. How extraordinary that such details should survive, said Dolly. Solicitors. Keep everything, said Slack dryly. Carraway had access to all the old files. She pieced together enough information to coach Kellaway, though as Miss Marple observed, they missed crucial details. The canon's limp, the hyphen in the word today, the proper names, and the sixpence itself, prompted Dr. Haydock. Simple enough. They bought an old sixpence of the right vintage and cut it in half with a jeweler's saw. Clean, modern cut. Not the ragged edge of a boy's penknife. Miss Marple spotted it straight away. Miss Marple smiled slightly. I remembered how it was done. Edward was so clumsy with the blade. It took him 3 attempts, and he nearly cut his thumb in the process. One does remember these small kindnesses from people one cared for. There was a brief silence, respectful and warm. Griselda Clement leaned forward. But Miss Marple, how did you know so quickly that the man wasn't really Edward Armitage? Even before all the mistakes in the evidence? Miss Marple considered the question, her blue eyes thoughtful. It was partly instinct, my dear, and partly observation. Edward had a particular way about him, a gentleness, a genuine diffidence. Mr. Kellaway was playing a role, and underneath the performance one could sense the actor's calculation. He watched us too carefully, gauged our reactions. Edward never watched. He simply was. She paused, then added more softly. And then there was the matter of his death. His death? Dolly looked puzzled. Edward Armitage died in 1900 in Durban. Dr. Haydock was kind enough to verify it for me through shipping records and cemetery registers. He contracted fever while helping at the docks during an outbreak. Died trying to save others, which was entirely in keeping with his character. Haydock nodded. Found the records in the Colonial Office archives. Edward Armitage, age 26, buried in the Durban Municipal Cemetery. There's even a small marker noting his bravery during the fever epidemic. So he was a hero, said Miss Vale softly. He was a good man, said Miss Marple simply. Kind and decent, if somewhat clumsy. Not at all the sort to change his name and hide from his past. When Mr. Kellaway appeared claiming to be Edward, I knew immediately something was wrong. Edward would never have pretended to be someone else. He was too honest for deception. Slack gathered his papers. Well, that's the lot of it. Mrs. Carraway goes to trial in July. Somerton's already pleaded guilty to fraud. The real codicil, by the way, will be honored once proper procedures are followed. The library will get its annuity after all, though it'll take time to sort through the legal mess. At least some good comes of it, said the Reverend Clement. After the others had departed, Miss Marple remained with Dolly in the morning room. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden light. For a time neither spoke. Finally, Dolly reached across and pressed Miss Marple's hand. My dear Jane, your first love. I'm so sorry for making light of it yesterday, and sorry still that it ended as it did. Miss Marple looked down at their clasped hands, then out the window at the garden where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. Do you know, Dolly? I think it ended exactly as it should have. Edward went to Africa and died helping others. I stayed here and lived my life in St. Mary Mead. We were both happy in our own ways, and we both remained true to ourselves. That is rather more than many people achieve. But don't you wish you'd had more time, that he'd come back? Miss Marple smiled, and it was a smile of genuine peace. I had what I needed. One summer of kindness, of quiet understanding, of knowing that someone saw me clearly and thought well of what he saw. That is quite sufficient for a lifetime of pleasant memories. She picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their familiar rhythm. As for the rest, well, one remembers the kindness, not the parting, and one is grateful that paper, stamps, and small hyphens do not forget. They helped reveal the truth, and the truth is always worth knowing, however painful it may be. Dolly rose and moved to the window, looking out at the grounds where spring was steadily advancing despite the tragedy that had visited Gossington Hall. You know, Jane, you're quite remarkable. The way you noticed everything, assembled all those tiny details into a complete picture. How do you do it? Miss Marple's needles continued their steady clicking. When she answered, her voice was thoughtful. People are very much the same everywhere, my dear. The same vanities, the same weaknesses, the same small betrayals. Once you understand human nature, the details simply fall into place. Mrs. Carraway wanted security and respectability. Mr. Somerton wanted money without effort. Poor Mr. Kellaway wanted survival. Each acted according to their nature, and each left traces of that nature behind. And Edward, what was his nature? Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her eyes distant with memory. Goodness, she said simply. Edward's nature was goodness. And that perhaps is why he's worth remembering, even after all these years, not for what might have been, but for what was. A kind young man who danced the lancers well and carried half a sixpence because a girl gave it to him on a summer evening. She smiled, gentle and serene. That is quite enough, Dolly. That is more than enough. Outside, the afternoon lengthened toward evening. In the garden, roses prepared to bloom. And in the morning room at Gossington Hall, an elderly spinster continued her knitting, content in the knowledge that justice had been served. Truth had been revealed, and old memories, however bittersweet, remained safely where they belonged, in the unchanging heart of St. Mary Mead.